keep your questions relatively brief, and if respondents could keep their comments relatively brief, then that will allow us to get through more questions and cover more ground. We have plenty of time, so please, if you could introduce yourself and then please go ahead.
Hi everyone, I am Elijah Weaver, and my question is for Dr. Ohanyan. I was wondering what you talked about first. So you're talking about like how your daughter talked about why are people talking about Ukraine but not Yemen? And I was just wondering, like, to what extent do you think that social trends in social media and peace building are prejudiced or preferential?
That's a very important question to ask for several reasons. On the one hand, I fully agree that I think some wars do not get the coverage that they deserve. And in general, I think if I speak only from the perspective of the United States, where I have more first-hand exposure, international news are more dominant. People do not think about the world in ways that they should. Interdependently, 9/11 was the only factor that all of a sudden kind of made people realize that conflicts are not sort of safely tucked away and they can have global projections. But I think and it is unfortunate that I think the media, it plays a hugely important role. And there are several problems with the way the media is covering some of this conflict. On the one hand, the Yemen conflict obviously did not receive the coverage that it needed, particularly considering the vast devastation of that conflict. So that's number one problem. As I mentioned in my comments, I do think that this conflict is structurally, strategically very, very different, because it is going to reorder the world. Hopefully there will be some order building happening after this. This continent is, in contrast, if you think about the African continent, Latin America, this continent is the one that is still stuck on imperial competition, neo-imperial competition. So while we hope that we would move to the multipolar world order where regional powers, Turkey, Russia, for example, China would project to take regional ownership, and then we'd move into this stable and developmental regions coexisting peacefully and will live happily ever after. That's not what's happening. The continent is divided by new imperial competition, and if we're not able to tame those trends, and Ukraine is really a critical conflict to that end. But since we're talking about the media, another problem with the coverage of the war, not just this war, is this both sidism. There is New York Times actually is very guilty of this too. There is this sort of one-sided narrative. While this is a very clear sort of a black and white conflict, but at the same time, I think there has to be a lot more granular approach to describing the conflict. Both sidism sometimes takes the pressure off the present, not so much in the Ukraine conflict, actually, for other conflicts as well. So I think the media has a huge role to play. And I honestly, this is my opinion, but I don't think media is sensitive enough to understand how should conflicts be covered. What is the moral center of the media? Just trying to be objective does not necessarily mean you lose moral compass in the way you cover a particular conflict. So I will stop here. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
I do Commander Van Peski or Dr. Urus. Do you want to jump in on that question, or Dr. Ohanyan's response? Okay, Dr. Urus, go ahead.
No, I was just confirming that I have nothing to add.
Okay. All right. I understand that there is a... Cecilia wants to say. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Cecilia.
No, just the question is so important. Why, right? And Dr. Ohanyan has already answered, but I think the one point is very important. This is really going to shift our whole world, the outcome of this conflict, and also how we're going to deal with, even if there's going to be a ceasefire soon, how are we going to deal with the fact that we had this conflict that's really going to change the world. I think the conflict that comes closest is the one in Afghanistan, very different, but totally not resolved. 20 years there, we left. There is no resolution to what has happened there. And it, of course, also was a big influence East-West. I don't want to just only say America, Russia, but there was a lot at play between this bipolar East-West dynamics. And it's the same now with the conflict in Eastern Ukraine. It's too shallow to, nobody said, but it's too shallow to say, oh, it's because they're also Christians and white and they look like us. It is part of it, but that's not the whole thing. It's the extent of it, plus I think the collective shock, especially here in Europe, seeing what is happening, collective shock that war is back. And we see it in our own wallets and in the gas prices and in our instability of our politics. Yemen, for example, doesn't have that effect on Europe. Libya doesn't have that effect on Europe. It has if the pipelines are not secure. It has if there is a further influx of refugees from Northern Africa, Maghreb. But it doesn't have to any extent as what is now happening in Ukraine. So that's the major reason why I feel it's getting so much attention. And it also, of course, should get so much.
Dr. Maru is also wanting to add to that.
Is that okay. Speaker? Dr. Mihai.
Dr. Maru, please, welcome. We're delighted that you can join us. Please add your insights.
Yes, thank you so much. And I want, since this is the first time I'm speaking, and I want to thank you, all of you at Becker Institute for inviting me. Just I want to steer a little bit the discussion by adding a few points on what Dr. Onan has said and others have commented on. And just I understand the geopolitics and the interest aspect is important in this kind of the attention that is given, the resource and the attention given by different countries. Geopolitical importance is important, as we have said, as it has been said in the case of Yemen, for example. But let me give you one current ongoing genocide in Ethiopia, the war in Ethiopia, and the special advisor on prevention of genocide at the UN has already highlighted, the Secretary General has highlighted, a UN commission has highlighted about atrocity that is ongoing. More than 500,000 people have died in the past 2 years in Ethiopia. More than 500,000. The attention is not even the fraction that it deserves. And how many of us, even in the academia, know about this? I think it is a serious question on the overall, not only humanity in general, but the structure of multilateral organizations, how they prioritize their agenda, and also how they react to different. I believe elements of racism play a role, no question. It's inbuilt in the system and the structure. I'll bring these pointers in my presentation later on, but I think it's very important in the academia, at least. Human rights values are so important. When institutions are devoid of those values, they will again and again fail, like they failed before in our the history of human being, the institutions of multilateral. I will highlight later in my presentation how Africa is reacting to Ukraine and why that is the case, even on referendums of annexation. We should have been universally rejected, but a majority of African countries are reacted in very, very weird, even to me, in terms of voting behavior. So I'll come back to this point later on, but I just wanted to interject at this point.
Stay tuned, folks, for the second panel. I understand that there is a Baker Institute person managing the chat and is going to present chat questions. Perhaps we could hear from that. A question from the chat.
Hi, yeah. We have a question from Etta Albright. If the United States is going to be instrumental toward rebuilding post-war, oh no, sorry, wrong. Here's the question. In regard to the commentary submitted, is there a concentrated effort appealing to the people of Russia and the world for the collaboration and cooperation to dispel the fear of dominant powers through violence and destruction?
Okay, presenters, do you want to hear that question again, or does someone want, Dr. Ohanyan, you want to hear it again?
But we'd love to hear the question again.
Okay, could you, Amelia, could you give us the question again?
Sure. In regard to the commentary submitted, is there a concentrated effort appealing to the people of Russia and the world for the collaboration and cooperation to dispel the fear of dominant powers through violence and destruction?
Dr. Ohanyan, you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah.
All right.
I think that's an important question. The very public diplomacy is the key word here. So one of the challenges as to why it's difficult to exercise public diplomacy in this case is because very often, and I don't want to generalize, these types of wars tend to be carried out by deeply authoritarian states because authoritarianism, militarization, centralization of power, they all go hand in hand. And Russia has experienced a significant breakdown, decline. It was a relatively open democratic society under President Yeltsin in the 1990s, but there has been a steady decline in authoritarianism. Right now, the Kremlin controls all of the levers of public discourse inside Russia, which makes it very difficult to get messaging in. So that's number one as to why it's difficult to reach Russian society. So propaganda is a powerful tool, and actually I was talking to some of the students yesterday about this. So that's number one. Number two, I think Russian society, and I'm generalizing again, is described usually as a conformist. And then, like, political culture is a very difficult thing to study and measure, but in general, public protest, there were attempts at the beginning of the war, there were anti-war protests happening in Russia, right at the beginning, but the heavy-handed use of force really dispelled it. This last wave of mobilization, many thought that Putin has been delaying it. There's a reason as to why he's not calling this a war, but calls it a military operation in order to prevent for the war to seep into Russian discourse. But even with the mobilization, which he called partial mobilization, he was afraid that there would be protests against this. What has happened? Many Russians have left. Actually, there are a lot of Russians moving to post-Soviet states. I was in Armenia this summer, and the presence of Russians in the streets is noticeable. So that also took the pressure off. But in general, I think I don't have a good answer as to how in these conditions, when protest activity is not happening, public messaging is very difficult. How do you get, there's a lot of, this war is not popular. Nationalism voices, pro-war voices are a lot more visible because the Kremlin is surrounded, is listening into the security apparatus, to certain security voices. But in general, this is not a popular war. Crimea annexation gave Putin a very big boost, but this war is really not popular. Those voices are not heard. One last point. I love the work of Erica Chenoweth, who has argued, and Maria Stefan, who has argued that effective non-violent disobedience, going back to Gandhi, going back to Martin Luther King, that strategically non-violent protest is more effective, and that if societies mobilize 3% of the population, they'll be able to overwhelm the security forces of the state. In Russia, we saw there were several cities there were anti-war protests, but the numbers still significant, but for a population of 140, that just was not enough. So the big question is why Russians do not come out in bigger numbers. And if they did come out in bigger numbers, I do think they would have overwhelmed the security forces. I don't want to minimize the risks of protesting in Russia, but I think that's the challenge.
Any other of the panelists want to address that question? Okay, do we have a question from here? Do we have the mic?
Sorry, one back here.
Got it. If you could introduce yourself, and please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Riley, and my question is specifically for Dr. Urus. How likely is it that the environmental factors that we want to see implemented after everything is calmed down is likely to happen? Because as I'm sure we all know, developing and redeveloping nations are very unlikely to be environmentally friendly as the rebuilding is happening.
Dr. Urus, were you able to hear Riley's question okay?
Sure, yes, I heard. I mean, I heard 80% of it, but it's, if I understand correctly, it's about the reconstruction, how to ensure that it is environmentally sustainable. Well, usually you get this, let's say, indicators whether there is this willingness to take environmental issues into consideration seriously. A major reference is the communications with the government counterparts. In addition to the strong civil society in Ukraine, well, many different UN organizations have been invited by the Ukrainian authorities to carry out different levels of assessments linked to natural resources and also linked to environmental issues. This is quite rare to find, especially when a conflict is going on. The initial requests to multiple UN agencies came even in early March. So they, even before the EU accession process started, there was an interesting critical mass of requests coming from those authorities to carry out assessments, to make sure that these damage on the environmental places or different components of the environmental, let's say, sector are registered correctly. They ask for improved capacities of the inspectors of the State Environmental Inspectorate to make sure that the content, for example, the soil samplings or any assessment are carried out in the best scientific methods available. They ask for the review of their approved national assessment systems. So these are like signs that they really take it seriously. And as the, let's say, a big component of the national economy relies on agriculture, and on the other hand, their track record of environment was not that good because of all the old technology industrial facilities, especially on the eastern sides. They really wanted to have probably a clean page when the time comes for the reconstruction. If you look at the environmental recovery plan, it's a very comprehensive, a huge, sometimes I call it like a wish list, but it has almost everything in it. So these are very good signs. Of course, it's not going to be easy, that's for sure. But these are very good signs for UN agencies, for the European Union institutes, and also for the civil society to use for their future advocacy and lobbying work when the time comes for planning and implementing the recovery and reconstruction. So I really want to keep positive hopes for that. Thank you.
Terrific. Amelia, do you have another question from the chat that you can offer?
Amanda wanted to speak also.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Please, Commander Van Peski.
Yeah, just very clear. I'm not the environmental issues expert, especially not as my distinguished colleague speaker, but as many of you know, I've lived in Ukraine for many years, working for the OSCE. And what I was always struck by is that there was already a really well-established lobby in Ukraine on protection of the natural habitat. I remember Ukraine used to have a lot of forest, steppe forest, but forest was already under great threat. And it was a they had very harsh rules on illegal wood chopping for your own fireplace in your house. I witnessed often that people who had just like a few buckets of wood that they got from the forest, that they were fined very heavily for doing so. So this was not the wild west without any rules. There was a lot of comprehension in Ukraine that it was important to safeguard your habitat. And I've always felt personally more intuitive. Like the Ukrainians, of course, they are not the little farmers that Russia wants them to depict them as, simple folks who are just simple farmers. But they do live very close to nature, much more than the average Dutch person, much more than the average European. And may I say so, also quite much more than city folks, let's say, in the US. They are very aware of processes of growth, of the growth of the sunflowers, the corn, the rye, the watermelons that we are seeing now in the ads of the Ukrainian armed forces. They had the black earth, remember? Chernozem it's called, which was so very, very good soil, and that needs to be protected because it's also getting depleted. I think one of the big problems, as far as I can see, is this problem with the asbestos. The asbestos is everywhere in Ukraine, and it's everywhere in a country like Georgia, for example, as well. It was massively used during Soviet times for any type of constructions, farmhouses, stables, houses, governmental buildings. And this is a huge problem, which I have no answer to. But the Ukrainians themselves, I feel, are very sensitive for their natural habitat, and that's a good thing.
Thank you, and I apologize for not seeing your hand waving. It just shows that it takes a village to moderate a discussion. So please continue helping me out. Hey, Amelia, do you have another question from the chat, please?
Yeah, we have one more, another one from Etta Albright. While the focus is on the dynamics of actual war, don't you think it's time we openly embrace the powers behind the motivation, pitting the us against them mentality?
Okay, I'll open that up to anyone on the panel who'd like to address that.
Oh, Commander.
Commander Van Peski.
But I would like to let my colleagues, but this is such a good question, just like the other questions were very good, but this is such a good question, because what's happening, I cannot say mainly in Europe, I haven't been much in African countries lately, but in Europe, it's such demonization of the Russian citizens. It's like, it's really, really bad. And it comes from lack of understanding of the situation, lack of having context with Russia. Like I already said, like nobody in the Russian Federation, obviously, but already in the past, I never met, or like, it was so difficult to find people who speak Russian, have been to Russia, studied in Russia. In the military where I'm now, the only Russian speakers that are there, they don't tell you that they're speaking Russian because there's a special reason why they speak Russian. But I know that they're in very limited numbers. We don't have many. And all the other military in European armies have never been to Russia because they were not allowed to, because of their position, right? So it's pure demonization. People don't understand how Russians think. And from the other side, I would say it's the same, right? When I worked in Donetsk, in the Donbass, of course, I heard many horrible stories about how we are in the West, and how, like Europe, and how Americans are, and that we molest children, and etc., etc. So it's like, because we don't cooperate together or have exposure to each other, things are going really wrong. And I know the Baker Institute has always been a huge proponent of bringing people together and offering that opportunity for dialogue. Just one thing, maybe as an example for any of you who's interested in that. I mentioned this before when I was at Juniata. There's a very interesting peace project in Israel. It's called the Peace School, where they bring people together, Israeli and Palestinian citizens, to break through these stereotypes, because they're in a similar situation, demonization of the other in the nation. So we know that there are examples, like may they be like short, like little, of how many people they affect. But I'm always thinking, why don't we on the bigger level? And we will need it, people. We will need it, because we will have generations of traumatized people in Russia and in Ukraine.
Anyone else on the panel want to address that question?
I'll add something super quickly from a different angle. The quantitative studies on armed conflict actually demonstrate this very fascinating trend that war as a military tool to achieve goals is increasingly ineffective. And some scholars describe this as the evolution of non-victory, meaning that obviously this Russia, when it comes to Russia, it's always difficult to see to what extent this is a specific case, it's a unique case, to what extent this is like a typical authoritarian state that is engaged in warfare, to what extent the peace process around the Donetsk in the eastern Donbass region broke down, and could have, if that peace process was given a chance, whether that would have averted the war. But I think this notion that evolution of non-victory, that either both Russia and Ukraine actually end up losing quite differently from this war. At the strategic level of the conversation, I think that's going to require a different process. Obviously, we would all want for negotiated settlement, and the politics surrounding it is very difficult. But I think when it comes to dialogue groups, I think we know enough that promoting conflicts, connectivity, those are all important. But we also have to be cognizant that those types of things, the spillover is very limited. And I would argue that down the road, reviving the economic connectivity between Russia and Ukraine is going to deliver the biggest boost in recreating, salvaging some of the connectivity that existed between the societies. They're intermarriages. I mean, these communities are deeply, deeply intertwined. So I think working towards opening borders, recreating economic ties is going to be necessary, but at the same time, the critics would say there's a lot of economic interdependence between the two countries, and that was not a guarantee that we did not prevent the war. But still, I think that remains a necessary tool, I would argue.
Okay, we have a question right here. Again, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
All right, I'm Julian Vidula. I'm a politics student. I was wondering, Commander Van Peski, if you've met any of the men who have been fleeing from Russia to avoid the military service, and like how they are received in other countries, and like if they're like being given like assistance like integrate into those societies, or if they're like trying to be like shooed out of the countries that they arrive in, like what is it like for them to be received?
Commander Van Peski, could you hear that question well enough?
Yes. Not all of it. It's about military, how they are being received and how they're being reintegrated in society, but which military?
I'm sorry, the men fleeing Russia, like how are to like.
So are you talking about civilian refugees rather than military?
Yes, the ones avoiding military service.
Okay, the Russians avoiding military service.
Yes, I'm sorry for being unclear.
Yeah, they are layers to this actually. Can I will get to this question, but one thing, because what Anna Ohanyan said, Dr. Ohanyan, also all research shows this. Old-fashioned type of warfare is not bringing us peace. We've seen this. In next year, in 2023, we will be commemorating 75 years UN peacekeeping. For sure, Baker Institute will also have some activities on that, and we're organizing activities here in the Netherlands as well. But definitely we're not saying we're celebrating that, because we're getting less and less UN peacekeeping because it's not effective as it has been. We know parts of it are effective, but we need to find different ways. And what is in a way very scary at the moment, that European armies and other armies are only boosting up their armies. The German army government has donated or allocated 100 billion euros to their armed forces. This is incredible. These are amounts that we can't even fathom how much money this is. This is also money that is taken away from energy transition that we need, from environmental protection, from any green deals for the future, or progressive peace for the future. We're going backwards. We're going back to types of wars that we had 100 years ago. And even though I'm in the Navy now, which I'm doing with all, very big motivation and very consciously, I'm also doing that because I'm seeing it's important that I also voice another voice, right? That people hear something else also than only the old-fashioned type of war. At the other hand, I also understand that when things go really bad, and they could still go very bad, for Ukraine it is already very bad, but also for Europe, that we have to have something like well-trained and well-prepared armies, because if we don't have then so we have to be prepared for the worst, but at the same time develop parallels for peaceful settlement and negotiation. I think in the Netherlands, so to the next question, in Europe and in the Netherlands, we're having hardly any men who are trying to evade being drafted for the army in Ukraine or in Russia, because they just can't enter. The women and the children came. The only men I've seen are either handicapped or invalid or just sick, for example, and they couldn't fight. Georgia is one of the last countries that's having a free visa policy for Russians. So Georgia is the last country having them. I was in Georgia in July last time I was there. I'm usually there twice a year. It's swarmed with young, bright, progressive, healthy, well-educated Russians. So it just also to give you the description, many of them working in IT, so they can just do their job wherever they need to. Some of them even told me, my boss, they had a boss in the US or in India or whatever. It doesn't even know where I am. They don't know that I left Russia. I can just do work from my computer. I'm now just doing my work during the night because of time difference, where I used to do it during the day, things like this. But they were young and I basically integrating quite well in Georgian society. Now it's a much bigger number. Now it's really those who also are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s even, trying to evade being drafted to the front. That's a different story. And you can really see that for the small nation of Georgia, with only 4.2 million inhabitants, it's very difficult to have that great influx, but also how to deal with them. And at the border with between Georgia and Georgia and Russia, there were people standing there demonstrating with big banners saying, "You're not welcome here. We expect you to go and demonstrate to your own government. Tell them that they're doing wrong. Don't just come here and don't demonstrate. You have to make the change in your country." That's very deep. You understand, right? It's very deep emotional values, very deep.
Dr. Ohanyan also has some thoughts.
Great comments from Commander Van Peski. Simply to add the political risks that this Russian and Greece create for the state where they're moving. So these are Russian citizens, and this whole war in Ukraine is justified in the Kremlin as Russia protecting Russians in Ukraine. So the scenario of securitizing the Russian minorities in post-Soviet states is a scenario it's there. I'm not saying that Russians will do it, but the fact that you have so many Russians in Georgia has been obviously a lot more contentious. The numbers have been between Armenia and Georgia have been more or less the same. But there were two waves. In Armenia, where I essentially observed them, there's a big wave of families really moving right after the war, when when it started, mostly from the IT sector. They were able to move their businesses because they could not access they couldn't carry out financial transactions, etc. So there's a lot of Russians who moved because of that. But after this last mobilization, that I have not observed on the streets. But the danger that it creates for the state is that these are political ticking bombs, if I could put it this way. Down the road, this creates a stress on the states because number one, there could have been spies that have infiltrated to keep track on these individuals from the Kremlin. Number two, if Russia wanted to pressure these states, it could have created all kinds of legal, political challenges for them, and really put the governments in the middle because there are also now like anti-Russia protests in some of these countries, and the government, both Russia and both Georgia and Armenia, do not want to be so so explicit against the Kremlin. So they're sort of right in the middle. It really creates a push for on these governments to speak up much more than they have.
Okay, we have one more question, sorry.
Absolutely, and we're just about to the end of our time, so this will be the last official question in this time period, but we have the coffee break for you to continue on the discussion. If you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ava. I'm exchange student from France. I have a question especially regarding the European foreign security policy, so it might be a question for Commander Van Peski again. You mentioned that there are a lot of Russian civilians that had to come back, especially painters, dancers, and I don't understand like what was the strategy of the European foreign security policy about that. Like, why wasn't there the possibility to ask for a political asylum or something for those people who were working in countries of Europe, especially? I don't know if my question is clear.
Merci beaucoup, Eva, je vous en prie. It's a complicated question as well. I didn't fully get it, but I think you are interested in European security, right? And that is a good thing. So it was a bit in my slides as well, but we didn't have time for everything. But let's look at each other Monday and Tuesday when I'm in Huntingdon, Eva, so I can give you more answers. There were two major, at the EU level, two major documents, and there was one on the Dutch level major document this February till March. First one was the EU Compass, which is it's the new compass for the EU security. The other one was the NATO strategic direction document. So a renewal of NATO interference, NATO approaches when it comes to security, also so for all NATO members, and therefore also for Europe, because most NATO members are European, where of course the strongest one is non-European because that's the US. But besides to that, a new defense policy on the Dutch for the Netherlands national level. Other European countries might also have had this year. They're dependent on when were elections held. And of course, the Dutch national defense notion also directed more financial resources to boosting up the armed forces, but also very much towards inter-European cooperation, and specifically with Germany and Sweden. That's the major allies for the Netherlands. It's not France, not your country, Eva, because we are having difficult misunderstandings or misinterpretations about the use of submarines. You have a big submarine industry, and my nation has it well. So it's competition, and competition is a very bad thing at the moment between European nations, industrial competition and political competition, because we still should stand as one. That is very clear. We are standing quite as one, but not fully. The fact of that we have had Brexit, of course, is a very, very big threat in all this as well. You can see that Britain is in many different ways trying to hook on to Europe when it comes to security strategy. I myself at the moment am the director of a military mobility office in Germany, where I'm not telling you any secrets here. I wouldn't be able to, but you can also read it. Basically, like how can we make sure that the European ports are strong? And then in this case, the Dutch ports. We have 3 major seaports going out on the Atlantic. We all know people that when things go really bad, that's the ports of embarkation, the ports where the entry ports where American personnel and material will arrive through NATO forces if they need to come to Europe. And they are already coming in much bigger numbers, and they will move through Germany towards the Polish border, through Poland and to the Baltic states. Also a bit more southern, Romania, Bulgaria. So this is actually what is happening at the moment. And what is the most important, like overall in this context, is, and it's my opinion, but and also not everybody will agree, but Europe is in the middle of this, in between these 2 big powers, West and East. We don't have full consensus amongst our members, but definitely we need to make sure that we're not depending on others when it comes to our security in Europe. So I am very much in favor of boosting European security, and that means having better prepared armed forces, but also more resilience in the overall population. Very important. Preparing people for what might happen. I'm in favor of working on having a European army. So not national armies, but a European army. With the European history, with what happened in the Second World War, of course, this is difficult to achieve because we have all kinds of elements installed to make sure we don't have one strong force army in Europe. But now the times have changed and we do need it. And personally, my prediction would be we will have a European army, or let's call it a European Schengen army, military Schengen, but we don't have it yet. But it will. Everything that's happening now will give a great boost to it, and I will always fight for it. That this is a peaceful army, an army like the UN peacekeeping forces, for the blue helmets. That we will have a peacekeeping army in Europe that really is of serious substance, and that can really help boost security in Europe and in the countries around it.
Well, we are at the bottom of the hour, so that brings a close to the